Hello, good morning. I wanted to come on live today because, okay, good morning. Hi. I wanted to come on live. I'm on YouTube and I'm on Instagram. I haven't been live on Instagram or YouTube for that matter in a really, really long time. And I figured, why not now? So I wanted to talk about hormone therapy specifically. We're chatting about compounded HRT. And I wanted to talk about compounded bioidentical. I have a session coming up on April 9th, and it is called Not Your Mom's HRT. And so if you haven't heard me talk about it, one of the reasons why I want to talk about this topic, I'm super passionate about it, is what I do day in and day out, is talk about hormones and hormone therapy and perimenopause and menopause. And I think a lot of people, unfortunately, we see women in this stage of life who are super desperate. And I see it all the time because no one is listening to them or their symptoms or their concerns, and no one is giving them the proper information. And a lot of times I see their medical providers not even giving them the time of day. Like the amount of times I see patients come to see me and they'll say, "Oh, my doctor said that I'm not old enough to start hormones," or I don't know, I have to wait till my period stops, or they're not comfortable giving me anything. And really, they're at like the perfect spot to be starting hormones. But I also find that there's a lot of noise out there when those people go to their providers and their providers say, "Nope, I'm not going to give you any hormone therapy. Sorry, see you later." They start seeking out other avenues, right? They might see a naturopathic doctor, they might go to a clinic that tells them that they're going to get hormone therapy, or they might, whatever they're going to do. And I find that a lot of patients stumble across information that just is not true. So I wanted to take today's live video to kind of talk about a small piece of that. And also let you know that on April 9th, I'm doing an entire deep dive session on hormone replacement therapy, the benefits, the pros, the cons, who it's for, what the research actually says, all of the different types and doses and formulations, and what's real and what's not, and all of the different nuance to that. I mentioned yesterday talking about vaginal health and the importance of that, and something I'm super passionate about is helping women really understand what's normal and what's not from that perspective, because it's something that we feel is taboo to talk about, and so we don't. And so anyways, today we're going to talk about bioidentical. Specifically, something that got put on my radar yesterday was something called Biote, and it was pellets. And the reason why that came across my radar was because I mentioned that I stumbled across a study yesterday that was talking about the HRT implant. And that HRT implant was something that is a new technology that they're trying to create so that it can be a different method for giving this hormone replacement therapy. Because like I mentioned yesterday, if you didn't see my stories, we have a back order pretty much nationwide on the patches. And so a lot of my patients are having a really difficult time getting access to those patches. And as a result, they're being given alternatives. And some of those alternatives are honestly really sucking. And so I was just bringing up the idea that having alternatives will be kind of critical to having women being able to have access to these things. And then someone told me the implant is already something that they're doing at a clinic in the area. And so I wanted to look more into this because the research that I had read was an implant. Essentially, I'm not sure the frequency that they would put it in, but essentially it was like an FDA regulated amount of hormone therapy. They would put the implant in and you would leave it in for, whatever period of time. And then they would remove it and they'd put a new one in. That was kind of the idea. And so I really want to talk about the idea and the difference between bioidentical compounded hormone therapy and bioidentical non-compounded hormone therapy, because I think this is where a lot of people get confused when it comes to what the best options for them are, what's more natural, what's going to be, have less side effects and everything else. A lot of people are really drawn to bioidentical Because essentially, when we look at hormones, we have kind of two classes of hormone therapy. We have bioidentical, which is body identical, and we have synthetic. Okay. We hear synthetic and we get really freaked out. But bioidentical is, body identical. It is basically as close to your body's hormones as possible. Okay. Just because something is body identical or bioidentical does not mean that it has to be compounded at a specific pharmacy by a human every single time that you get a refill on that. Okay. When we look at the use of bioidentical hormones, the official statements from all of the menopause societies is that a compounded prescription is not the recommended course of action from a hormone therapy perspective. And I think a lot of people get confused by this because I see patients and they're automatically like, I want bioidentical. I want bioidentical because I want it to be closest to my natural hormones. I'm like, great, that sounds great. But that doesn't mean we have to get a compounded cream, okay? So let's talk about the differences between the different kind of delivery options. So as a naturopathic doctor, I have access to prescribing hormone replacement therapy. We have access to prescribing bioidentical hormone therapy. And so the way that a lot of naturopathic doctors do this is they will write a prescription for a bioidentical progesterone cream and a bioidentical estrogen cream. They will send it to a compounding pharmacy, which will then have a human compound this formulation for you and give you that prescription. Some of the cons of doing that is that when we compound anything, we are leaving it up to human error, okay? So in a lot of these creams, we may have dosing that is a little bit less consistent in each dose. So if we're being given a product that's like a pump and we use that pump, let's say it's like, 1 pump a day, we don't necessarily know that every single pump has an equal amount of dosing. And I've seen this where I've moved a patient from a bioidentical compounded estrogen cream to a standardly available, FDA approved bioidentical, still bioidentical, but a gel or a patch. And patients do so much better when they're on the consistent dosing. So that's the first thing, is your dosing is inconsistent. The second thing is there's a couple principles when it comes to hormone replacement therapy in general. The principle, no matter which route you're going, is we ask the question, do you have a uterus or do you not have a uterus? If you have a uterus and you are starting hormone replacement therapy, meaning you are being given estrogen, you have to have a progesterone. And the reason for that is because one risk of being on estrogen is that your lining of your uterus becomes too thick. When the lining of the uterus becomes too thick, this is problematic and this increases your risk of endometrial cancer, for example. Okay. So uterus means estrogen plus progesterone. How we deliver that progesterone, when we look at the evidence, our goal here, again, there are a lot of benefits to progesterone on its own, but the goal of the HRT, regimen is that we're protecting the uterus. So 2 ways we can protect the uterus is with oral progesterone or with the Mirena IUD. Okay. We don't have enough evidence to say that any of the bioidentical creams, because again, dosing can be inconsistent, and we don't have any evidence to say that topical progesterone creams that are compounded are effective enough to protect the uterus. And so because of that, another reason why I don't typically give or recommend any compounded progesterone creams is because we don't have enough evidence that that actually protects the uterus. Okay. Now, there's other ways to deploy progesterone if you don't tolerate it well, but this is kind of just the baseline. We have to understand, do you have a uterus or do you not? If you don't have a uterus, then we're free to do whatever feels best for you, right? Compounded hormone therapy is also more expensive. And so if we're looking at this from a cost perspective, most of my patients being put on hormone replacement therapy are planning to be on hormone replacement therapy for the foreseeable future, right? Typically, it's at least like 5 years, unless they want to reassess sooner, but typically it's at least 5 years. And so from that perspective, we have to look at it from a cost standpoint, right? When we're doing supplements and we're doing like a 4-week, reset or a 4-week protocol or maybe an 8-week protocol, at the end of the day, it's 8 weeks of your life, right? Typically, we're not so focused unless it's a major concern about, what is this going to cost me over 8 weeks? Because it's a game changer, because it's 8 weeks and then we're done. But with something like hormone replacement therapy, we have to be super mindful that this is going to be a monthly cost for the foreseeable future. Your hormones are not coming back. And so cost is actually a big part of the conversation. And when we compound, specifically when we compound prescriptions and we get them done at a pharmacy, they're more costly. And so a lot of times, if somebody has a drug plan, we know that they're going to actually have coverage for those FDA approved, regulated, pharmacy available products like the patches, like the gels, versus going to a compounding pharmacy and having it specifically compounded is going to be a lot more costly and oftentimes is not fully covered by a drug plan. So we have to look at the cost long term. We have to look at the dosing, the lack of consistency. When you're on a progesterone cream, this doesn't necessarily protect the uterus. And so those are just some things to consider. And when we look at the official statements, like I said, from pretty much all of the associations, mainstream guidance, the Menopause Society states that hormone therapy is the most effective treatment for bothersome vasomotor symptoms, but it is not recommended to use compounded bioidentical hormone therapy because the safety and the efficacy has not been assessed. I also find that when it comes to the compounded creams, so if we're doing, let's say, a patch, we use like Estradot is one of the common ones that we see. Estradot is delivered in a patch. It is bioidentical. It is body identical estrogen delivered in the form of a patch. Same with Climera, body identical estrogen delivered in the form of a patch. When we get into the oral estrogens, those are synthetic. Okay, so there's a lot of reasons why we probably wouldn't do oral estrogen, but it is still done. And then we get into the synthetic hormones. Astalis is a patch that has progestin synthetic and estrogen synthetic. And so that might be another conversation. But there are a lot of bioidentical options that are going to be covered by your drug plan, and they are regulated, and the dosing is standardized, and you can find them at any pharmacy. And so a lot of people feel like we only can do creams that are compounded that are super expensive if we want to be more quote unquote natural. But there are actually a lot of products that are available pretty much at any pharmacy. And what I tell patients is I personally love a compounding pharmacy when I'm sending these prescriptions because I find that they just have a lot more expertise when it comes to hormones. Like they're just really good at helping patients. And so I use a lot of local compounding pharmacies, but your local Costco, your local Shoppers, your local Rexall will have the majority of these prescriptions. And so it's easier to get, right? It's easier to get when we're looking for these particular preparations. Now, when it comes to safety, I think there is a misconception that going on a bioidentical compounded product is going to be safer. And the reality is it's not. It's not safer to get a cream compounded at the local compounding pharmacy than to be on an Estradot patch or a gel or whatever. It's not safer. They just don't have the same monograph and warnings that are attached to it, but the risks are the same for transdermal estrogen, an estrogen cream, whether you're getting it compounded bioidentical, which like I said, less consistent, more costly, not worth it, or you're getting a product that's available. Yeah, so a lot of the prescriptions, Stephanie commented that the 37.5 is out of stock, and so now they're cutting bigger ones. It's a little bit of a nightmare in terms of getting the products right now. And so a lot of people are struggling with, like we can always move to the gel, like from the patch. A lot of my patients like the patch because it's like set it and forget it, right? But when it comes to alternatives, like Divigel is just a daily application. Again, it's a gel, it's absorbed, it is standardized, it's not compounded, but it's bioidentical, right? And so I think that's the biggest difference. Now, the thing that kind of sparked this conversation that came across my desk, for lack of a better term, was the I'm going to pronounce this wrong, but there's a clinic that does Biote. So it's basically a branded pellet-based hormone therapy. And so this is what came up to me. This was sent to me directly that, a clinic already does these implants, when I brought up the idea that they're looking at an estrogen implant, which I think would be really cool. one thing I think needs to happen though is that it needs to be made in a way that is, similarly regulated to what we see with Divigel and what we see with the Estradot patch and Climera. Um, and so I think that it could be a good alternative because we have such a crappy backlog of all of these hormones. So anyways, I looked into this because I thought this is neat if they're already doing that. And so going through this, what I found is that it actually is very similar to your compounded products that are done at the pharmacy. So they're going to be more expensive. They're going to be less consistent. And also safety and efficacy, in my opinion, is not confirmed. So I think that a lot of these products are a little bit risky. And I also think that when you're inserting these pellets, again, the idea is that they insert these pellets and then over a period of time, they release whatever hormones they need to release. But at the end of the day, the question remains, if the dosing is less consistent because it's being compounded in a way that we know makes dosing less consistent overall, what sort of dose are you getting from day to day? And then how do we allow for changing that dose as we need? I feel like it's a little bit out there. The other thing I noticed on their website when they were talking about this specific hormone pellet therapy was that I'm just looking at, again, actually, there is a statement about these pellets specifically from the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, and they say that because of the lack of safety data and inability to remove the pellet easily once placed, it recommends preparations other than pellet therapy, specifically as it pertains to testosterone delivery, because we don't have a lot of flexibility for changing that. Now, one thing that I don't like seeing when I see hormone therapy on any platform, whether it's with a medical doctor or it's with a naturopathic doctor, is testing your hormones to see what dose you need. Because when we look at hormone therapy, the deal is if you're 45, statistically speaking, you're in perimenopause. If you're younger than 45, you could be in perimenopause, but we need to identify if you are, right? Because so many things overlap with perimenopause. We really need to understand, like, are you even in perimenopause? We need to rule things out, right? Before the age of 45, it's a diagnosis of exclusion. After the age of 45, like if it walks like a duck, talks like a duck, it is, right? So when we talk about blood work, it's not that we don't do blood work ever and we're just like guessing. It's that clinically speaking, over the age of 45, hormone blood work is not a useful part of our assessment, right? If you're over the age of 45, testing your estrogen is not going to give me any different information than not testing it. If you're under the age of 45, your periods are still regular and you have all of these symptoms, anxiety, irritability, periods changing, etc. Well, I want to make sure like we test your thyroid and your iron and do you have insulin resistance and do you have inflammation? Because we can't forget, just because the internet only wants to talk about perimenopause, other things other than just hormones do impact all of these symptoms, right? So again, if somebody is over the age of 45 and they have symptoms of perimenopause, even if they have regular periods, we can consider hormone therapy. And so that's just based on a conversation. But what we don't want to consider is testing your progesterone and your estrogen, because that often becomes disappointing. A lot of patients are like, I feel like finally someone's going to understand my symptoms if we can just test my hormones. They convince their doctor to test their hormones. And, their doctor's like, yeah, you're completely fertile. Everything's amazing. Keep on keeping on. Have a good day. Right. And so that becomes frustrating. And my conversation with the patient is usually like, that didn't matter. It doesn't mean that you're not going through perimenopause. It just means that that day that you tested your hormones, especially if your period's erratic, they were just looking, quote unquote, okay, right? Timing matters. Even if you are a younger cycling female and we're trying to understand your hormones, timing matters, right? In perimenopause, we have all of these things doing this. And so we could just literally catch you on a day where things looked really good. And then we say, yeah, you're fine. You don't need anything, right? It doesn't change anything. So if you're over the age of 45, we don't do hormone blood work to give you hormones. We also don't do hormone blood work to monitor where your hormones are at. Really, that just goes by symptoms. Are you feeling better? I go through, something called a menopause rating scale with my patients. And if you're feeling better, great. If you're not feeling better, again, I'm not just using hormone therapy and then saying bye-bye, washing my hands clean of it. We're using hormone therapy as a tool as part of a bigger picture. So we've already looked at insulin and inflammation and nutrient deficiencies. We've looked at someone's iron and vitamin D. We've made sure that their gut is functioning appropriately. We've looked at their diet. We're getting them moving, right? So there's a whole picture to look at here, but testing hormones is not helpful in any way, shape, or form. I have patients that literally their doctors are sending them for hormone blood work every 3 months at the age of 60 on hormone therapy. I'm like, what are you doing? So that is not helpful. So I think a few things to watch and to note is that number one is be cautious when you hear the word bioidentical. Just because it's compounded at a pharmacy does not make it safer. Okay. Naturopathic doctors, if that's who you're working with for your hormones, still have access to regulated, standardized bioidentical products. They're still body identical. They still look like your hormones, but they're just safer and more regulated and honestly cost less. And so that's advantageous in general. Second, red flag. If anyone wants to keep testing your hormones, using a Dutch test, using a saliva test, using serum, if you are over the age of 45 and you are on hormone therapy, in whoever you're working with is like, we need to make sure your levels are good. And we test, that's a red flag because you don't need to do that. That's not the standard of care. That's not how we change your dose. That's not how we update your dose. There are going to be specific, unique circumstances where that would be helpful, right? In somebody who had a hysterectomy but still has their ovaries, they had a hysterectomy at 28, testing their hormones is probably going to be helpful, right? Because they haven't had a period, they haven't had a uterus since 28, right? Like there's always going to be those scenarios. Talking for the large majority of individuals, it's not helpful, okay? So on April 9th, I am diving into this in my Not Your Mom's HRT session. This is virtual, but also in person. Tickets are really inexpensive because I want you to be able to get this information. And we're really talking through a lot of these concepts. This was like the tip of the iceberg as far as these conversations go. I want you to know who needs hormone therapy or who would be a good candidate, how to tell, what the benefits are, what the risks are, because I want you to look at the risks from an evidence-based perspective, not from research that's 25 years old. I want you to look at like how we look at these pieces, what the different formulations are, what the different routes of administration are, how we monitor success, what else we need to be what else we need to be mindful of, and so much more. Yeah, so someone who is turning 37, getting hormones tested if things are feeling off. So I think the first thing that I like to look at in terms of, explaining this as an overall concept is, and nobody be offended by this concept because I use this to explain to a lot of patients how things move. Essentially, we can think about your body as having a hormone factory, okay? We have a hormone factory. We have machines that are just like doing their thing in the factory. As we get older, that factory, when we're younger, something breaks in the factory, we replace a part, okay? As we get older, some of those factory pieces get rusty. And so it takes a lot less for things to start to go a little bit wonky, right? And so as we get older, we're more likely to be influenced by outside things that when we were younger, we were more resilient to. The hormones are often like the last piece to fall in the entire picture. And so when we have hormone symptoms or things are feeling off, looking at hormones might be part of the picture for sure, especially if somebody has, cycle-related issues. I often like mapping out hormones using something like Mira because it gives us a little bit more of that day-to-day fluctuation as opposed to like one moment in time. Oftentimes with my patients, I'm starting by looking at insulin, doing a 2-hour insulin glucose challenge, looking at inflammation because we know that if there's insulin resistance and inflammation, those things are more than likely driving the bus, right? I talk about this concept about driving the bus. Like if we're not addressing the bus driver, like the bus driver is taking us where we're going. And so if you have insulin resistance or inflammation, like that's where we're going. So the hormones, it doesn't matter what they're doing. And in fact, we could probably give you a bunch of hormones, whether it's thyroid hormone, whether it's estrogen, like whatever makes sense for you. And you're probably not going to feel good still because insulin resistance and inflammation are driving the bus. So we have to fix those things first. And at that same time, we might be looking at like, are you ovulating, doing LH strips? Like I always give patients options of kind of where we start. We can start light, we can go deeper. If there's gut issues, we have to look at that, right? It's a part of a bigger, greater picture. And so starting by looking at insulin, inflammation, nutrient deficiencies, gut health, I find is the best way to go about it, because oftentimes when we fix those things, other things fall into place. And again, this is patient dependent, because if we look at PCOS, for an example, we know the reason why you don't ovulate in PCOS, why you don't have any progesterone in PCOS is purely because of the insulin, right? When you have insulin resistance, that's going to cause you not to ovulate. So it's not like, oh, I just have a progesterone deficiency, I'm going to take progesterone, or I'm going to take Vitex to like bring up my progesterone, which a lot of practitioners will do. It's like we have to fix the insulin, because the insulin's the reason why your progesterone isn't going up. So that is kind of how I would start there. So yes, 37, it can be super useful to test hormones, because again, if you're in like premature ovarian insufficiency, then going on hormone replacement therapy, among other things, is really, really helpful here. But if we haven't looked at anything else, we haven't looked at everything, then we don't know the full picture, right? So my session on April 9th, if you guys want to come, grab your tickets. You can go to www.laurapiper.com/events. The virtual link is $19 to attend virtually. If you're attending in person, it's $29. You're going to get, obviously, to come in person, beverages and snacks. It's going to be a really good conversation. I would highly suggest anyone over the age of 35 come into this conversation. And the reason for that is because too often I see patients who have waited too long. They're like 48 and they've been struggling for 10 years. And they should have had this conversation with their doctor. And when we look at, vaginal health, we know that, starting understanding that, knowing what to look for, it's so far beyond like pain with intercourse, right? It's about the structural integrity. It's about UTIs. It's about yeast infections. Like we have to understand, where we're at or what we're looking for. So if you're 35, if you're 37, if you're 42, and you're like, my periods are still regular, great. Your periods could be regular till you're 57. That's fine. But knowing when these conversations are appropriate to be had, because from my experience, your family doctor is not going to have this conversation. It's just not. So knowing when to have these conversations, I think, is a really, really important thing to do. And then also for in-person people who come on April 9th, I'm doing a little bit of an extended Q&A. So I'm going to have my presentation kind of for everyone on Zoom. Everyone gets the Zoom recording, whether you're in person or you're virtual. But the people who are in person are going to have access to that extra half-hour discussion. It's going to be a small group, honestly. So it's going to be really good, and there's lots of opportunity for discussion. So if you want to get the virtual link, you will be sent the recording. The recording will be available. So if you get the virtual, you're not attending live, you'll still get the replay. And everybody will have a month to watch the replay after the session. So even if you can't come live, you can still get the recording either way from a virtual perspective. And if someone is like, can I have access for longer? You can just send me a message. I can give you access for longer if, life happens and things come up. So anyways, I wanted to talk about that because I think it's really important. If you've just joined this conversation late, this will be posted on my page. I know it's long to watch, but if you're wanting to sit back and just understand these things, if you have questions, feel free to comment below. Otherwise, if you can make it on April 9th, that will be a really good conversation. And as you can probably imagine, there's just so much nuance to this that I think gets missed and overlooked. And a lot of people don't know. Well, we don't know what we don't know, right? So I think this is an important conversation to have. And I also feel like I'm going to come on live a little bit more often. I think it's fun to get back into that and have these conversations as opposed to like video snippets or story snippets. And then it's easily understood and shared. So anyways, I hope everybody has a great rest of your day, great rest of your Thursday. And hopefully I see everybody on the 9th. Again, it's www.laurapiper.com/events. If you go to my website, you can just hit events at the top and you can register. Easy peasy. And if you can come in person, I would love that. And if you can't come in person, no worries. and have a great rest of your day. Bye, guys.